The operator was 3 hours into the dive when the sonar return came back wrong. He was sitting in a cramped control van on the deck of a research vessel somewhere in the North Pacific. Eyes on a monitor, hands on a joystick, flying a remote submersible along a stretch of trench floor no human had ever directly surveyed. The plan was routine. Map the contour. Tag anything interesting. Come home. But at roughly 4,200 meters, the sonar sweep painted an object that had no business being on the seafloor. Too flat, too symmetrical, too large. He eased the drone forward, asked the camera team to light it up, and when the floodlights finally caught the shape, the van went very quiet. According to a technician who was in the room that night, within 40 minutes of that footage being beamed back to shore, someone in uniform was on the phone to the vessel's captain, and by the next morning, a military escort was already on its way. That is the story, or at least the version of it, that has started to leak out of the project over the past few months. Names remain scarce. Locations are deliberately vague. The crew members, who have spoken on the record, have done so quietly through a science reporter under conditions that protect their livelihoods. What they describe is, at minimum, an unusual find. At maximum, it is the most interesting deep ocean anomaly of the decade. And it deserves to be talked about carefully, because the story sits at the intersection of real science and the kind of rumor that grows teeth in the dark. The vessel in question was a civilian research ship operating under a contract with a mix of academic and commercial sponsors. The mission, as originally scoped, was geological. The seafloor in that part of the Pacific is a maze of fractures, seamounts, and ancient lava flows. The research team was interested in heat vents. Any unusual chemistry down there can hint at life forms we do not yet fully understand, the kind of microbial communities that thrive on minerals and volcanic warmth rather than sunlight. That is the kind of work the drone was doing, looking for vents, taking samples, watching the bottom. At the moment the anomaly appeared, the drone was crossing a relatively flat plain between two rocky ridges. There should have been nothing there but sediment. The object the sonar picked up was sitting at a slight tilt, embedded partially in silt, with clean geometric edges sticking up above the surrounding mud. Early footage showed what looked like a disc-shaped or saucer-shaped structure, perhaps 20 to 25 meters across, with a surface so smooth that the drone's lights reflected off it in a way that marine engineers in the van found unfamiliar. According to one of them, nothing natural he had ever seen down there behaved that way with light. The closest comparison he could make, and he was very careful with his words, was polished metal. Of course, that is not proof of anything. The ocean floor is littered with human-made objects. We have been dropping things into the sea for a long time. Airplane wreckage, ship hulls, deliberately sunk submarines used for diving exercises, abandoned oil and gas infrastructure, even old Cold War hardware that was quietly lost and never publicly accounted for. Any one of those could produce an unexpected metallic return in a spot where no records indicate anything should be. The first and most responsible hypothesis, always, is that a strange find on the seafloor is something human, sitting somewhere humans forgot to record. But this is where the story gets more specific. According to the operators, the object had no hull plating of a familiar type. No rivets, no weld lines, no visible hatches or ports. The edges curved continuously, without the straight seams you would expect on a manufactured vessel. When the drone passed close enough to attempt a magnetic reading, the instruments produced values the team later described as inconsistent with any of the alloys common in shipbuilding. That could mean corrosion has changed the chemistry over time. It could mean the drone's instruments were confused by local geology. Or it could mean the object is made of something unusual. At this stage, no one can say. Within hours, the incident moved out of the hands of the science team. The captain of the vessel, who had the legal authority to report unusual findings, filed something with maritime authorities. From that point on, according to the technician speaking now, decisions stopped being made on deck. The research ship was told to mark the coordinates and leave the area. A military vessel arrived not long after, in what several crew members described as an unusually fast response for a location so far from any major port. The research team was politely but firmly told that further survey operations would not be continuing that week. They went back to their original schedule. The anomaly was not mentioned in any public report from the mission. All of that could have a completely ordinary explanation. When a civilian vessel stumbles across what might be sensitive military hardware, it is not unusual for authorities to arrive quickly and take over. Lost equipment, classified test platforms, sunken vessels with materials the governments would rather not have photographed. These all exist in every major ocean, in numbers most civilians would find surprising. The rapid military arrival, on its own, does not require anything exotic to explain. It is actually exactly what you would expect if the object turned out to be something human that the state once handled. But the crew members speaking now insist that what they saw in the minutes before the feed was cut and the data was sealed did not look like a conventional military platform. And that is where the story starts to pull at the edges of the simple explanation. The immediate response from mainstream oceanographers has been, broadly, skepticism. A marine geologist at a large American university, asked to comment, pointed out that the ocean floor produces a surprising number of shapes that look artificial until you examine them more closely. Mineral formations, methane hydrate plates, old sediment domes. Even ancient lava tongues can solidify into geometric patterns that a passing drone might easily mistake for manufactured hardware. His argument, which deserves real weight, is that a brief sonar return and partial video are not enough to distinguish between a truly anomalous object and a natural feature that happens to catch the eye. Without a sample, without a careful second survey, the honest answer is that we simply cannot be sure. Another expert, a retired naval engineer, takes a different angle. He finds the quick military response suggestive, but points to a long list of historical incidents where similar responses turned out to involve known, classified hardware. He suggests that the object, if it is artificial, is far more likely to be a lost experimental platform, possibly decades old, than anything from outside human engineering. His framing is simple. When the unusual explanation and the ordinary explanation compete, the ordinary explanation wins the majority of the time. That is not a dismissal. It is a reminder to stay with the most likely story until evidence forces you elsewhere. Still, there is a genuine mystery layered through this account. No government agency has publicly confirmed any operation in that area during the relevant time frame. No military release has acknowledged the retrieval. The research institute involved has declined to discuss the dive in detail, citing contractual obligations. And the technicians speaking now have repeatedly said that they are not claiming to know what the object is. They are only describing what they saw, how quickly authorities responded, and how firmly the data was removed from their custody. It is worth placing this in the context of the broader conversation about unidentified objects that has shifted over the past few years. For decades, serious discussion of anomalous craft was confined to the fringes of public life. That changed when multiple major governments began, tentatively, releasing footage and acknowledging that some unidentified aerial phenomena remain unexplained. The scientific establishment, which once considered the subject untouchable, has been edging toward real study. Committees have been formed. Data collection protocols have been proposed. None of that means any of the objects in question are of non-human origin. It simply means the question is now being asked seriously, in places where it used to be left off. The ocean, in this context, is interesting. If unusual objects do cross into Earth's environment, as a non-trivial number of former military officials now publicly claim, the seafloor would be a plausible place for some of them to end up. The oceans are vast. They are undersurveyed. A crash that happened 50 years ago in the middle of the Pacific could sit untouched until a passing research drone happened to pass within a few hundred meters of it. That is not proof that anything like that has occurred. It is simply to say that the geography makes the question a little less absurd than it might first appear. What would it take to resolve this particular case? In the ideal world, a careful, independent follow-up survey with the full sensor suite that modern deep ocean technology can field. High-resolution sonar, magnetic gradient mapping, chemical sampling of the sediment immediately around the object. Ideally, a small piece of material brought back for metallurgical analysis. None of this is guaranteed to happen, and if the site has already been cleared by a state actor, as some in the research community now privately suspect, the chance of independent verification may have already passed. Meanwhile, the internal debate among the crew has split into camps. Some believe the object is most likely a Cold War-era test platform whose loss was never publicly acknowledged. Others believe it is a piece of much older, unexplained debris that happened to be rediscovered. A smaller group thinks it is too geometrically clean to be anything previously documented. None of them, to their credit, are willing to claim certainty. They want better data. That is the right instinct. There is a lesson in this story that is worth carrying forward, whatever the final answer turns out to be. The deep ocean is one of the last places on our own planet where genuine surprises are still possible. We have mapped more of the surface of Mars in high resolution than we have of the floor beneath our own seas. As drones get better and cheaper, the rate at which we stumble into unusual finds is going to climb, not fall. Most of them will have ordinary explanations. A few will not. Sorting the two apart, patiently and without rushing to conclusions in either direction, is going to be one of the quieter frontiers of the coming decade. What happened that night in the control van, according to the people who were there, has stayed with them. The technician speaking now described the feeling of watching the lights catch the edge of the object and seeing something that did not fit into any of the categories he carried in his head. He did not panic. He did not leap to claims about visitors from other worlds. He simply said in the interview that he felt the quiet certainty of looking at something he could not name. Then his screen went blank, the feed cut, and by morning he was being asked to forget what he had seen. Whether the object is a forgotten military platform, an ancient piece of debris, or something stranger, we probably will not know for some time. But the coordinates exist. The footage exists. Enough people were in that control van that the story is not going to quietly disappear. Somewhere, 4,000 meters down in the cold and the dark, something is sitting on the ocean floor, and the question of what it is remains open. That is a rare feeling in a world where most questions have been answered for us. It is worth sitting with without rushing to decide. If you have ever felt the pull of the old mysteries, the ones that sit just beyond the reach of our instruments, this is one of them. The sea keeps its secrets longer than the sky does. And once in a while, one of those secrets surfaces carried, up on a frame of sonar returns and a trembling video feed, waiting for someone brave enough or patient enough to go back and look again. One element that has not been explored much in the early coverage is the chain of custody around the original data. According to the technician, the raw sonar returns and the video feed were stored, as is standard practice on research vessels, in redundant drives both on the drone's internal memory and on the ship's main data server. Within the hours after the military arrival, a technical team came aboard and took custody of the drone itself, along with the primary copies of the data. That, in itself, would not be unusual in the case of accidentally discovered classified hardware. What the technician noted, and what has kept this story alive, is that certain backup copies that should have existed on the ship's general archive, according to normal procedure, were not there when the team went looking for them a few days later. He does not accuse anyone of tampering. He simply noted the inconsistency. For scientific work that depends on complete data provenance, That kind of gap is the sort of thing that keeps people quietly upset for years. There is also the strange coincidence, if it is a coincidence, of other similar reports from different parts of the world ocean over the past decade. A European research team working in the Atlantic described an anomalous metallic reading at significant depth that never received the follow-up survey time it was promised. A team in the Indian Ocean reported an unusually symmetrical structure in sonar data from a seamount survey, only to have the dataset marked as restricted after submission. None of these accounts, individually, is conclusive. Some of them have probably mundane explanations that simply have not been made public. But the pattern, such as it is, has been noticed by a small group of researchers who now track these stories informally, comparing notes at conferences, wondering whether the seafloor is quietly accumulating a list of objects that someone, somewhere, does not want inspected too closely. To be fair to the alternative explanations, this is also exactly the kind of pattern the confirmation bias loves to construct. Once you start looking for unusual deep-sea finds, you will find them because the deep sea is itself unusual. Most of the reports on that informal list probably do have ordinary answers. Sunken equipment, misidentified geology, data processing errors. The human mind is very good at stitching unrelated anomalies into a story that feels coherent, especially when the story involves objects we wish existed. A careful investigator has to hold the pattern at arm's length and ask, each time, whether there is actually evidence or only the shape of an idea. What most of the scientists closer to this particular case seem to want is fairly simple. More openness. Better protocols for what happens when civilian research vessels stumble across unusual material. Clear rules about how data is preserved, even when national security considerations come into play. None of that requires accepting any exotic hypothesis. It just requires recognizing that the ocean is a shared human inheritance, and that discoveries made inside it should not disappear into administrative silence without some form of eventual public accounting. That is a reasonable position, whether the object turns out to be a Cold War artifact or something stranger. There is also quietly a growing interest among private deep ocean exploration groups in revisiting areas where past anomalies have been reported. These groups, some funded by wealthy individuals with an interest in the subject, are now fielding submersibles capable of reaching depths that were, until recently, the exclusive domain of state-level programs. Their technical capabilities are real. Their scientific credentials vary. But the mere fact that independent actors can now, in principle, return to a given set of coordinates and take a closer look changes the equation. The era in which anomalies could simply be walked away from, with the expectation that no civilian would ever have the means to re-examine the site, is slowly closing. If a follow-up survey does eventually happen, the most likely outcome, statistically, is a disappointing one. The object will be identified as something human, something prosaic, something that had always been there and was simply never recorded. That is how most of these stories end, and it is not a bad ending. A mystery resolved is still a mystery resolved. The less likely outcome is that the object turns out to be genuinely unusual, in which case the scientific process will have to do what it always does, which is examine the material, write the papers, and let the evidence speak for itself over time. The least likely outcome, the one most of the internet is hoping for, is the most dramatic. A piece of technology that does not belong to any known civilization. That possibility cannot be entirely ruled out by responsible people at this stage. It also cannot be responsibly claimed. So we sit for now with a story told by a small number of people who were in a control van on a research ship, describing what their screen showed them one night over deep water. It is not enough to prove anything. It is enough to be worth remembering. And if, in 5 or 10 years, better data emerges, we will know a little more about what was down there, and maybe a little more about how our institutions handle the things they find at the bottom of the sea. Until then, the ocean keeps its silence, and the people who were there keep their memory of a small, cold light moving over the edge of something that did not look quite like anything in their training manuals. Whatever it turns out to be, it is a reminder that the world is still larger than our maps of it, and that the frontier, for those with the patience to look, is still very much open.